I'm very happy to see that so many of you joined the first colloquium for this year. And today we have our colleague from Fiskasruhe. Maybe at first I say that I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Fiskasruhe, but also a coordinator of the Detroit Leibniz Science Campus. And the Leibniz Science Campus is the organizer of these colloquia. This is a regular meeting. It takes place every month, and every month we talk about a different area of research and the effects of digitalization in this area of research.
Yes, thank you, Anja, very much. The reason why I am introducing this speaker is because I recruited him for this colloquium today. I am a lawyer by training, and I am part of the legal dimension in the project, aiding our partners with anything legal and ethical regarding their data. And naturally, of course, I would propose a legal speaker for today. He is my colleague who's also working with me on an NFDI project for agro that deals with the agro system science data. And there he deals mainly with EU data law and the intersection of law and technology, which is why he's also perfect for today, because he combines the legal expertise also with some technical knowledge. And so therefore today he will talk a bit about how to make legal data machine actionable. Yes, and I give over to Constantin. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Let's see the standard is this switching, but this should work. It seems like it. So yeah, thank you very much.
It works. We see your screen.
Thank you very much for the introduction. So this talk will be more of an overview, not like concrete tool. I will not really talk about concrete tools or such, but more like what aspects does law or making law machine actionable have, or yeah, what can be automated? What does automation mean? And also mainly in regards to research data and its metadata. So there are several different aspects already, if a very, very broad view on it, regarding what could be machine actionable law. And with like two big sides to it and a bit in between is a law as code. That means concepts which translate legal texts or laws themselves as published, as created by parliaments, into code to make them evaluable. Yeah. So to make their application more efficient. That has its limitations. I will talk about that a bit later. The in-between thing is legal metadata, as it can mean what law maybe applies to some data. So if it's maybe personally identified information, or are there usage limitations, are there licenses, stuff like that, but also other metadata which is not like on the first view legal metadata can be such, or can become in the right context legal metadata. And the last is as it floats around a bit regarding contracts, smart contracts. So that means concepts of basically self-executing contracts. That term came up with blockchain-based technologies, but overall it's a really vague term. And the features often associated are self-executing. It's on some kind of blockchain, and cannot really be modified from the outside, but also leads to certain limitations when it will be used. And also sometimes you have to really ask yourself whether or not that helps your goal. Also, the European Union tries, or in the Data Act, there is a law about smart contracts, but not really. So if they basically describe it, but really vague, do not use the term. And also, this law will probably be removed, or at least is removed in the currently proposed digital omnibus, which mostly affects GDPR and other stuff, but also that's side note in this regulation proposal. But why would you want to do that? So mainly 4 reasons. Yeah, it could make your work as a researcher more efficient. It could lead to more compliance, legal certainty, and findability of information. Well, why compliance? Legal requirements are mostly, so as far as I understood researchers, you want to work on your data, you want to do something with that. You don't want to think about how you license it or what you can do with it. You just want to use it. And that can be complex. But if it's maybe copyrighted, that's kind of straightforward. Usually people know what licenses mean. If you get to the GDPR and personally identified information, that already gets more complicated, as you have to have an idea about when it's applicable or not, and that's even for persons with a legal background complicated to determine. That could be maybe automated, but also runs into a limitation of automating law for researchers. So that in the end could lead to so that either legal compliance is avoided, or we always do this, which is maybe wrong. So coming back to the license examples, if you have dependencies for software and you do not really check it and just put an MIT license on it because I don't care about the software, I just don't sue me. That was a bit. So you may want to automate as much as possible, and also have an idea when it's not possible anymore, when you have to ask your legal department, maybe. And that gets even worse if you have obscure regulations, to say. For that, I want to illustrate the building blocks of machine action law with an example of such obscure laws. Well, for most of you, it will be a really obscure thing. First, a plant. So you want to, I don't know, you own a company, you want to sell beautiful plants. So Costus montanus, this is a plant which only you can find in Costa Rica, or maybe you are a researcher wanting to work with it. And you look at a repository and you find this metadata. So its name, that the sample was extracted 2016 in Costa Rica. IRCC, the abbreviation is for internationally recognized certificate of compliance. I will come back to that later, what that means, because there's a whole framework around this thing. But first I wanted to show you a beautiful flower. And as the sample is available in the collection, and also just some research institutes can use that. And now you wonder, so I can just go and use it? I'm a researcher, I want to sequence it, or want to grow one of those things because I want to see how it behaves. Well, when you look up a bit and see there's a whole international agreement, or 2 international agreements, or 1 international agreement and a protocol to that, the Nagoya Protocol, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the Nagoya Protocol. Usually, if you're not in this area or just sometimes work in that, you don't know it. And even if you work in like biodiversity, it's rather obscure, and even when it's applicable. So the idea beyond those international agreements is basically that you to prevent biopiracy. So to prevent that people from other countries extract value from your local environment, from your from your fauna without sharing the benefits with you, or you having control about whether or not that is used. Those agreements are enforced since roughly 2014, at least in the Nagoya Protocol, which precized the Convention on Biological Diversity, and means essentially that the parties to this agreement have to respect access and benefit measures by the countries they want to use something from. What is the something? That is genetic resources and traditional knowledge associated to it. That could mean like healing plants, or well, any plant basically. And there's also at EU level an accompanying regulation, which, yeah, for example, leads to this documentation duties. So now you have several levels how data is relevant for also how this could be automated, and how data or metadata relates to that. So, for example, simple data regarding the sample or this plant is most relevant for this regulation. That's this access and benefit sharing regulation of the EU, which basically implements this international agreement, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the Nagoya Protocol at the EU level. It mainly concerns documentation and due diligence duties. So that is information that you usually already have regarding a plant. Even without this regulation, you as a researcher are interested where it was extracted, when it was extracted, who did it, maybe even who used that stuff before you. And but at the same time, you can use this information to fulfill your legal duties. So I would consider that well, and sometimes data sets are even lacking that. So maybe if it's personal identifying information, there's some document somewhere else we have to look up regarding how it's used, what data is included in that. So extending metadata regarding that already makes life for researchers easier and is kind of automating stuff away. For example, regarding this information required by the this regulation, there is it's called bioschemas. So it's a variant of schema.org, building on top of schema.org for metadata, and the types concerning themselves with samples could or maybe will be extended to include information which is required by this regulation, so you don't have to keep paperwork or Excel sheet or however you document stuff. But then building on top of that, you could, well, implement services. So as mentioned earlier, if you don't work that often in the area or just starting, it's really complicated for you to find out whether or not this protocol applies to you, or it applies to, or this agreement and regulation apply to your sample. One approach is to, well, one part of is to teach researchers about it. That's what my colleague Leah is doing, actually. But also a way would be to, well, just evaluate the relevant information. So, for example, the Nagoya Protocol is applicable if this thing comes from a party state. So those are the green states. The European Union as a whole is just party to this protocol, which is also interesting. But you could basically build a service which just tells you and integrate it in your research infrastructure. So you look up the data set, and then that thing calls some sort of API and basically tells you, hey, you maybe should look up whether or not there are access and benefit sharing measures related to this sample. You think, yeah, but as this access and benefit sharing measures are local laws, well, I cannot tell it what exactly I have to do. Well, there's a limitation I need to talk later about, but mainly boils down to it's hard to interpret law automatically and expensive to have it done manually. There is already like in Nagoya lookup service, somebody implemented that, which also does a reverse geo lookup. So basically give it coordinates and then it resolves that. But it's sadly really old at this point. Good. So, and then we have this hard legal data, which could be also include in the infrastructure. I just pulled something from GitHub in this case, as if you include it in your metadata, basically, I mean, at GitHub, you just put a license file inside the repository, which you could consider metadata, but makes it easy to find that, and which is also, it's not completely automating that, but making the life easier for researchers. Well, as you can see it at a glance. You could, yes, there are approaches which don't use this license file, but include this for every file in a repository to make that more granular. But the essence is the same, that you can automatically summarize basically legal information about this repository. Besides such license information, that could also be restrictions and agreements. Well, the main problem then becomes how you interpret that or how granular you want to become. For example, regarding license information, there is the de facto standard GitHub uses for software, but also SPDX identifiers, which give a unique name to licenses. But what do you do regarding more granular restrictions? So I'll come to that later. What approaches are used there? Which have all their own problems. Yeah, implementation of these various things. So yeah, simply data and services, as mentioned, are mostly already there for other reasons. You want to know where it was extracted, but sometimes or often regarding using metadata to automate or at least reduce the work for researchers, boils down to not having standards for that. So for example, this regarding Nagoya information, there is at the moment no standard which includes this this IRCC, this internationally recognized certificate of compliance, which basically tells you, yes, this was extracted according to the local rules. You don't have to do any due diligence yourself. You don't have to see whether or not, you basically save a lot of work looking stuff up. So that's useful to have in the metadata of a sample. Nobody includes that. Similarly for example, GDPR information. So not always there's included the purpose for which the data was collected, or if there's any, or in what circumstances an anonymized data set remains anonymous, as kind of depends on what information you add to a data set to make the include data identifiable again in the GDPR terms. So it should maybe include that in the metadata. So do not combine it with data sets from city XYZ, or suddenly you have PII on your hands and you've got a problem. For services to implement them, you have to translate it. It is a big if-else block you basically write. So nothing fancy, but somebody needs to do that. And that also, again, points to a limitation I want to talk about later a bit. Yeah, regarding legal data, you as well need to translate it. So what a license means, or use a shorthand. So there's a standard license is nothing else than a building block. It's not the license itself includes several clauses which then have this regulatory effect. But in the end, you, instead of saying, hey, I do not want to be liable for this, I want that derived software is also under the same license, I want people to be able to use it, you basically collect that, do it, and make a building block out of that. So instead of listing all of that I just did, you basically say, yeah, I want to use the GPL. And that already is a way to make stuff easier. But what do you do if you want to use more granular limitations? And there are several approaches. One of those is we have Open Digital Rights language, basically an open source digital rights management language, where I can express permissions, restrictions, prohibitions. So how people should interact with something. And then the problem is that you suddenly don't only need to know the name of a license, what it encompasses, but then on a detailed level. A way to create such metadata or to create such data is basically use a translation service. So you have building blocks on one side, which are more granular than a whole license, but basically express, I don't want to be liable, and then translate that for you into an automatable representation, as ODL is mainly aimed at machines. You can read as a human, but yeah, you need to know a lot of context information, the really rather complex information model behind that. Another approach is to use controlled natural languages. For example, Lexon, a colleague of mine, recently published a paper on that, and that summarizes the problem with such approaches. But first, what does a controlled natural language mean? Basically, you use a really, really structured language, which looks like a natural language, which can be read as a natural language, but carries a ton of implications with it. Maybe you had a look at esoteric programming languages like Chef. So things that read like a recipe, but kind of a bit absurd. You're like, what's wrong with this recipe? Why is it structured this way? And you can easily make mistakes. You do not, especially semantic mistakes, which are not easily findable. And that's why what's Florian Edelberger wrote it, basically called it the uncanny valley of computational contracts, which is another term for smart contracts, but of such approaches. As you think you know what's written there, but in the end you don't. And you need to know a lot to properly write such contracts. So basically it doesn't help you by the goal to make it easier for you. So that's again why services should basically tell you, you want to have this with your data or this limitation, then we just include it for you and have a translation for you instead of trying to do both things at once. So having something human and machine readable. Yeah. Lastly, limitations. So you basically have legal and technical limitations. From a legal standpoint, you cannot really, or complex constellations, especially if they touch upon several legal institutes which need to be harmonized. So legal institute in the sense of a complex of laws and rules, which, for example, sorry, I forgot the word, consider themselves how property works and how contracts works, and then you have to kind of try to fuse that together. So that's where automation usually runs into a problem. Same thing with unforeseen constellations. Maybe you could try to basically roll the dice and see what comes out, but in the end, if the Federal Court of Germany decides on something, usually that makes news as it's an unforeseen constellation, sometimes not really foreseen how it was done. So trying to automate that could be nearly impossible, especially since lastly, law is, well, it's not like something given by nature or something like this. It's basically in some way, not perfectly, but social conventions and stuff. And it's about acceptance. So basically, that the parties, but in an abstract way, society as a whole has to be able to just say, yes, I agree with that. And have themselves basically seen. So that varies by field. So for example, for copyright, you don't really need this, a bit, to be honest, idealized thing of, our interests are both valued. But for example, if you try to automate like penal law, and suddenly somebody is sentenced to jail without seeing any human, that would not really work. But yeah, for researchers, mainly copyright and what's it called? Yeah, the GDPR and related things. So that's, at least they're not that hard of a limitation. But coming a bit back to complex constellations, legal metadata usually does not, or data on copyright, for example, does not reflect exceptions by the law. So, for example, copyright you can use copyrighted material to illustrate in teaching or in presenting stuff, which usually is not said in the licenses, but just comes from the, for example, German Urheberrechtsgesetz. It's called a Schrankes, or a limitation on how far copyright can be granted or is granted. So you would need to take that into consideration, the whole legal background of a license, and that's where you run into a technical problem. So you have to update those things, or you have to kind of include judgments on the matter, you have to include literature on the matter, and both of those informations, at least in Germany, are not readily available. So about 90% of judgments in Germany are not published. I mean, it's fine for small courts, but they also form the law and not just the text of the law. And you have to take that into consideration. And that leads to having it basically be impossible to automate that part. Except there's like standing, not judgments, but if a court always repeats the same approach, then you can try to translate that into rules, but that can get complex really quickly. And also, as we already mentioned, metadata is often not really standardized to include that information, especially on license information. Yes, for example, schema.org has a field for license information where you can just put in URL, which is usually an SPDX identifier. But if you want to use this ODL approach, which could be, I don't want to talk about JSON. If you want to include that, you suddenly have no idea where to put that. Or it's like uncanny metadata fields. So everything looks a bit like it could fit such information, but it does not allow it. Thirdly, you have to from a technical side, you get all the problems of natural language processing, And on top, that's a very specific natural language. That also hinders implementations for obscure laws. So I wonder if I include the slide. For example, if you have this national measures of some countries, apparently I did not. So for example, for the Nagoya protocol, there is a clearinghouse which provides you an API where you can basically ask, is this country party to the protocol and do they have national measures? Those are not standardized. It's like the law on biodiversity in Costa Rica. Now you would, if you try to automate that and without manually implementing that, get all the information regarding that and how it's interpreted and used, and somehow distill the correct answer from that, and an answer which a local court or whatever court is responsible for that does not throw out. Because if you do that, well, your solution is worthless. That's also why, you could think about large language models as a solution to that. But basically boils down to that. You cannot really assume expertise. Sometimes it works, and so it works surprisingly well, depends on what data it was trained on. I mean, the early ChatGPT or GPT versions at some point passed the bar exam in the United States because there's tons of information, probably because there's tons of information available online. At the same time, German law usually does not work that well, as information is not available. And also, you really need to consider when to use it, as using an LLM, you maybe do not get reliable information. Also, it's really inefficient for that use case. So if you can try, just do something rule-based, please do. Similarly, but more regarding enforcement, are smart contracts. If you just use you think of approaches as blockchain-based, they are really unflexible. So you cannot, and also because of that technology, inefficient. So you cannot kind of from the outside influence what it does. And if for this contract does not, for example, include legal exceptions, as using maybe copyrighted material for teaching, you cannot enforce that. So basically it's like, no, the license or the thing you implemented as a smart contract is wrong, but you cannot change that. And also regarding blockchain, sometimes it's you have to ask yourself if you need a decentralized solution. So yeah, to that, I come to the end. Regarding law as code, to have not individuals implement stuff, the Bundesministerium für Digitalisierung und Staatsmodernisierung has published this Modernisierungsagenda. And they have a point about law as code. So they basically want to have, it's not certain for what laws, but reference implementations. So you can try to automate at least some aspects of that. For law as code, you have a bit of a problem I just want to touch briefly on, because the majority opinion on in what way a law needs to be published is that it has to be in German and not in some kind of code. So basically you have to ask yourself how much you can rely even on this reference implementation. And what do you do if the text of the law and this code diverge? And also inside the NFDI, there's a working group on license and agreement and rule automation. It's part of a section ELSA. You can find more information at this URL, which basically works on tools to try to make handling legal information easier. So thank you. If you want to contact me, it's my mail address.